close your eyes and picture a medieval peasant. What do you see? A man in a dirt-brown tunic, his face smeared with grime, his expression vacant. What is he eating? In your mind's eye, you probably see a rough wooden bowl filled with a thin, gray, watery gruel. Maybe, if he's lucky, there's a hard, stale crust of bread to go with it. This is the image we have inherited, a life of miserable, monotonous deprivation, 1,000 years of culinary misery. This is the myth. It's a powerful image, but it's a caricature. It's not the whole truth. In fact, it's not even close. The reality of what a peasant ate is far more complex, far more resourceful, and infinitely more interesting. The peasant diet was a direct reflection of the world they inhabited, a world dictated by the relentless cycle of the seasons, the unbending rules of their lord, and the constant, precarious balance between survival and starvation. Over the next 2 hours, we are going to strip away the myth and reconstruct the real peasant diet, season by season, meal by meal. This is a journey into the heart of daily life, and we want you to be a part of it. We love to see how far these stories travel, so let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. Before we begin, what did you think a peasant ate? Your support is what allows us to create these deep dives. So if you enjoy this journey back in time, please consider liking the video and subscribe for more. Now, let's extinguish the cooking fire of myth and light the candle of history. Before the first mouthful of coarse bread or watery pottage passes the peasant's lips, his meal has already been claimed by others. Before he even rises from his straw mattress, his day belongs to another man. To understand what a medieval peasant ate, we cannot simply open a cookbook or list ingredients. We must first walk a mile in his rough leather shoes, feel the weight of his obligations on our shoulders, and see the world through his eyes. His diet was not a menu of choices. It was a testament to his station, a daily reckoning of what little was left after the powerful had taken their share. The story of his food begins not in the pot, but in the intricate, unyielding web of the manorial system. Imagine a peasant named John waking before dawn in his small, smoky cottage. The world he knows is the manor of Oakhaven. This is not a town or a city. It is a self-contained universe, an agricultural estate owned in its entirety by a lord he might only see a few times a year. At the heart of Oakhaven stands the manor house, a large stone building that radiates power, and the parish church, whose bells dictate the rhythm of John's life. His own village is a cluster of simple huts, and beyond them lie the lands that are his life's work. The great open fields, the meadows by the river, the common pasture, and the deep, dark woods. John is a serf. This is the most important fact of his existence. It means he is bound to Oakhaven. He cannot leave. The dust of its fields is in his lungs, the mud of its paths is on his boots, and its laws are branded onto his soul. He is as much a part of the manor's assets as the lord's prized falcon or his strongest ox. John's first thought is not for his own breakfast, but for his lord's work. Today is a work day, one of the 3 days a week he owes in corvée, labor. This is the rent he pays for the right to exist on this land. He will not be tending to his own meager strips of land today. He will be toiling on the demesne, the Lord's personal fields. The demesne is the best land on the manor, the most fertile and well-drained, and every ounce of grain it produces will go directly into the Lord's granary. John's labor today is for free. He joins the other men of the village, trudging out to the fields under the watchful eye of the reeve, a fellow peasant appointed by the Lord to act as foreman. The reeve is a man caught in the middle, disliked by his neighbors for enforcing the Lord's will, but driven by the fear of the Lord's displeasure. As John guides the heavy shared village plow, pulled by a lumbering team of oxen, his mind might wander to his own strips of land. These strips, his entire worldly inheritance, are not in one convenient plot. He holds perhaps 20 strips scattered across the manor's 3 vast fields. This open field system means he has a share of the good land and the bad, but it also means he is locked into the village's pace. He cannot innovate, cannot plant a new crop, cannot harvest early. He must work in concert with everyone else, a cog in a great agricultural machine. The cruelty of this system will become most apparent in autumn. When the harvest, the single most critical event of the year, is ready, the reeve will call for boon work. John and his wife, Matilda, will have to drop everything and harvest the Lord's domain first. Their own grain, the food that must last them an entire year, will have to wait, exposed to the risks of rain, rot, and birds, until the Lord's wealth is safely secured. This system of extraction follows him home. When John's labor for the day is done, the food Matilda prepares is a constant reminder of their station. The grain she uses to make their bread is not the fine white wheat that grows on the Lord's domain. That wheat is a cash crop, destined for the market or the Lord's table. John grows a hardier, coarser blend of rye and barley on his own strips, which produces a dark, heavy bread known as maslin. To turn this grain into flour, he cannot simply grind it at home. He must take his sack to the Lord's mill. The miller of Oakhaven is a sly, dusty figure, known for his thumb of gold, a knack for pressing on the scales to increase his own share. John will lose a significant portion of his precious flour, the multure, as a fee. Matilda cannot bake the resulting dough in her own hearth. She must carry it to the village's communal oven, a monopoly owned by the Lord. There the Lord's baker will take another payment, perhaps a small coin, or more likely a portion of the dough itself. From field to mill to oven, the Lord's toll is taken, ensuring that even the peasant's staff of life is a symbol of his dependency. The demands on their meager produce are relentless. A few weeks ago, the priest came to collect the tithe. This was the church's 10% tax on everything. The priest's servant had inspected John's livestock and chosen the 10th lamb, the 10th calf, and the 10th piglet. He had taken a 10th of the eggs Matilda had collected and a 10th of the milk from their single precious cow, Brindle. He even claimed a 10th of the vegetables from Matilda's small garden behind the cottage. This tax was levied before John had fed his own children, a constant drain of the best of his produce, flowing away to an institution that promised salvation in the next life, but demanded its payment in this one. When John's own father died last year, the family suffered the final indignity. The Harriet, the Lord's reeve, came to the cottage and, as was his right, claimed the family's best beast. They had 2 oxen, the key to their ability to farm. The reeve chose the stronger, healthier one, leaving them with the aging, weaker animal. It was a devastating economic blow, a death tax that ensured a family already reeling from grief was pushed further into poverty, making it harder for the next generation to survive. The Lord's logic was that the animal was a loan to the peasant to work the land, and upon death the loan was returned. To the peasant it felt like sanctioned robbery. Even the landscape around John is codified with rules of consumption. The great forest that borders the manor is a place of temptation. John knows that it teems with life: deer, wild boar, rabbits. This is fresh meat, a world away from the salted pork they might taste a few times a year. But all of this game is the exclusive property of the Lord. To be caught hunting, even taking a rabbit from a snare, is the crime of poaching, and the punishment is brutal. The manorial court might fine him an impossibly large sum, or the forest court could order him to be maimed, a hand cut off, or his eyes put out as a warning to others. So the forest remains a locked larder, its riches, visible but legally unattainable. He does, however, have common rights. He can take his pig into the woods in autumn to fatten on acorns, a right known as pannage. He can gather fallen branches for firewood, the right of hook or by crook, but he cannot cut down a living tree. Within this suffocating framework of rules and obligations there exists a hierarchy of poverty. John, with his 30 acres of scattered strips, is a villain, a man of some standing in the village. He has his oxen, his cow, his small flock of sheep. He grumbles about the Lord, but he has a stake in the system. His neighbor, Thomas, is a cotter. He holds only a cottage and a garden with perhaps a single acre of land. He has no ox, no cow. To survive, Thomas and his family must work for wages, not just for the Lord, but for men like John, helping with his plowing or harvesting, in exchange for a meal or a handful of grain. Thomas's diet is a shadow of John's already limited one. He is on the absolute knife edge of survival. This, then, is the world that sets the peasant's table. It is a world where his time, his labor, his property, and even his own person are not fully his. Every meal is an act of defiance against this system, a small victory won from the slivers of resources left to him. The dark bread, the thick pottage, the occasional taste of cheese or bacon, none of it can be understood without first tasting the bitterness of obligation that seasoned every bite. John's diet is the story of his subjugation, but it is also the story of his resilience, a testament to the enduring human ability to create a life and a culture from the crumbs left by the powerful. To truly grasp the peasant's diet, we must step out of the open fields of obligation and into the dark, smoky confines of their home. The peasant cottage was not merely a shelter. It was the primary theater of survival, a domestic workshop where the raw materials of the land were transformed into sustenance. The culinary world of the peasant was not one of recipes and techniques, but of profound limitations. The shape of their home, the tools they owned, and the very fire they cooked on dictated every meal they ever ate. Understanding this environment, the peasant hearth, is the key to understanding their food. Let us reconstruct this dwelling. The typical peasant house, especially in the earlier Middle Ages, was a simple one-room structure, often built on what is known as a cruck frame, two massive curved timbers hewn from a single tree and split down the middle, were raised to form an A-frame, creating the basic structure of the roof and walls. This design was efficient with long timber, which was often a controlled resource. The walls themselves were not stone or brick, materials of the Lord and the church, but wattle and daub a lattice of woven hazel or willow branches, the wattle, packed with a mixture of wet soil, clay, straw, and animal dung, the daub. This created a surprisingly effective, if not particularly durable, form of insulation. The roof was a thick layer of thatch made from reeds or straw, which, if well maintained, was remarkably waterproof. The floor was simply packed earth, perhaps strewn with rushes or straw for insulation and to soak up spills and waste. In some regions, the family might even share this single space with their precious livestock, a cow or a few sheep. During the harshest winter nights, the animal's body heat providing a vital source of warmth. It was a dark place with only one or two small, unglazed window openings that could be shuttered against the cold. In a world before glass was common or affordable, light was a luxury, and a large opening was simply a source of heat loss, the defining feature of this interior landscape. The true heart of the home was the hearth. Forget the romantic image of a cozy, stone-lined fireplace with a chimney. For most of the medieval period, the peasant hearth was a simple, open fire pit located in the center of the single room. It might be lined with a few stones, but it was essentially a controlled bonfire on the floor of the house. The smoke did not have a chimney to guide it upwards. It simply billowed up into the open rafters, filling the room with a perpetual, stinging haze before slowly finding its way out through gaps in the thatch or a small, dedicated smoke hole in the roof. This ever-present smoke was a nuisance that blackened the walls and rafters and stung the eyes, leading to chronic respiratory and eye problems. But it also served a vital, unintended purpose. The rafters of the cottage were a crucial storage space, and the constant smoke acted as a preservative, slowly curing and protecting any sides of bacon, strings of dried fish, or bunches of herbs. Hung there, protecting them from insects and spoilage. Managing this central fire was a primary daily chore, usually falling to the peasant's wife. Fuel, in the form of firewood gathered from the common woodlands, was a precious resource that had to be used efficiently. The right of hook or by crook meant that they could only take what was already dead or could be pulled down from a tree, with a shepherd's crook, a severe limitation. The fire was rarely allowed to go out completely. The embers would be carefully banked at night with ash and coaxed back to life in the morning, saving the considerable effort of starting a fire from scratch with flint and steel. This single fire provided all the light in the evenings, all the warmth in the winter, and most importantly, all the heat for cooking. The peasant's culinary toolkit, or battery as a professional cook would call it, was stark in its simplicity. It was dominated by one extraordinary and indispensable piece of equipment, the cauldron. This was a large, bulbous pot, usually cast from bronze or later iron, often with 3 stubby legs that allowed it to stand stably in the embers of the fire. Alternatively, it could be suspended over the flames from a chain and hook attached to a crossbeam. This single pot was the most valuable non-agricultural possession a peasant family owned, a precious heirloom passed down through generations, listed with care in wills and testaments. Its utility was boundless. It was the vessel for the daily pottage, the ever-simmering stew that formed the core of their diet. It was used for boiling water for washing or brewing, for rendering fat from the autumn pig slaughter, for making cheese from the cow's milk, for dyeing homespun cloth with plant extracts, and even when emptied, for doing the family's laundry. The absolute dominance of this one-pot technology fundamentally shaped peasant cuisine. The overwhelming majority of their food was prepared by boiling or stewing. Roasting, which required a large fireplace with a spit and consumed vast amounts of fuel, was a cooking method of the aristocracy, a sign of wealth and leisure. Frying was equally rare. Cooking fats like lard or butter were precious commodities to be eaten as a source of calories, not used up as a cooking medium. The beauty of the one-pot method was its efficiency and practicality. The cauldron could be left to simmer over the low fire all day, while the family was out working in the fields. Ingredients could be added as they became available, a handful of foraged greens, some leftover grain, a scrap of bacon fat for flavor. This created what is sometimes called a perpetual pottage, a stew that was never truly finished, but was continuously replenished, its flavors deepening and evolving over several days. On Monday, it might be vegetable-based. On Tuesday, a piece of salt pork might be added. On Wednesday, more grains would thicken it. This was the ultimate slow cooking, a dynamic, ever-changing meal that was both dinner and the starter for tomorrow's. Dinner. Beyond the cauldron, the tools were few and basic. There would be a long-handled wooden ladle for stirring and serving, essential for reaching into the hot pot. Spoons carved from wood or animal horn were common. Bowls and jugs were typically made of low-fired, unglazed pottery, known as earthenware, which was cheap but porous and fragile. More durable tableware was carved from wood. The trencher was the medieval plate, but it was not a plate as we know it. It was a thick, flat slab of stale bread, several days old, upon which the thick pottage or any solid food would be served. The bread would soak up the juices, and at the end of the meal, the trencher itself could be eaten, given to the dogs, or, as an act of charity, given to the poor. The most crucial personal utensil was the knife. Every adult, man and woman alike, carried a sharp, general-purpose knife, used for everything from eating to mending tools to cutting rope. At meal times, this single knife served to cut any solid food into manageable pieces. The fork was an object of alien curiosity, an aristocratic Italian fad that would not reach the common person's table for centuries. Food was conveyed to the Jew, the mouth with a spoon, the fingers, or on the tip of one's knife. The ingredients for the peasant's pot were sourced from a carefully managed portfolio of environments. The first and most vital was the small garden plot attached to the cottage, known as a toft or croft. This was the undisputed domain of the peasant wife, and her skill as a gardener was critical to the family's health and survival. This was not a flower garden. It was a high-yield vegetable factory. Here, she grew the essential flavorings for the pottage, what medievals called the loker, which included the trinity of onions, leeks, and garlic. Cabbages were a medieval superfood, easy to grow, high in vitamins, and hardy enough to last into the winter. Root vegetables that could be stored for months were essential. Turnips, parsnips, and carrots, though medieval carrots were typically white, yellow, or purple, not orange. But perhaps the most important crops were legumes, peas particularly. Field peas or peas and fava beans were the peasants' primary source of protein. They could be eaten fresh in the summer, but most were harvested and dried, providing a store of protein that would last through the winter and form the thick, nutritious base of the pottage. The garden also contained essential herbs, which served a dual purpose of flavoring and medicine. Sage, thyme, mint, parsley, marjoram, and hyssop were common, used to make bland food more palatable and to create simple remedies for common ailments. The second food zone was the commons. These were the shared lands of the manor where peasants held specific traditional rights. On the common pasture, a family might graze their livestock. A cow was a sign of relative prosperity, providing not just milk for drinking, but the raw material for butter and cheese, the white meats that were a vital source of fat and protein. Chickens scratched around the cottage door, providing a precious and regular supply of eggs. The ultimate peasant animal, however, was the pig. It was a low-maintenance, efficient converter of waste into meat. It could be let loose to forage in the woods on acorns and beech nuts, and fattened on household scraps. Its slaughter in the autumn was the most important culinary event of the year. Common rights also included istover, the right to gather firewood, and pannage, the right to graze pigs in the Lord's woods. Foraging on the commons provided a crucial safety net. Peasants gathered wild nuts, berries, mushrooms, and edible wild plants. They also kept bees in simple hives called skeps, as honey was for most the only available sweetener besides fruit. The third and final food zone represented the peasants' dependency, the Lord's monopolies. The journey of their essential grain was a journey through the Lord's control. It was harvested from their scattered strips, threshed by hand, and then hauled to the Lord's mill. After losing a portion to the miller, the flour returned home, where the peasant wife would knead it into dough. This dough was then carried to the Lord's communal oven, where another fee was extracted from the field. To the fire, the peasant's most basic foodstuff was subject to the Lord's economic power. This simple, smoky, one-pot world, with its minimal tools and its carefully delineated zones of production, the intensively managed private garden, the shared resources of the commons, and the inescapable monopolies of the Lord, was the reality of the peasant kitchen. It was a world of immense constraints, but also one that fostered a deep, practical knowledge of the land and an extraordinary resourcefulness in the art of survival. The arrival of spring in the medieval world was not met with the simple, joyful relief we might imagine. It was a season of profound anxiety, a desperate, walking on a knife's edge period known to historians as the Hungry Gap. This was the most dangerous time of the year, a crucible that tested the limits of a peasant family's planning, resourcefulness, and endurance. It was the period from late winter, roughly February, through to the first small harvests of early summer in June, when the food stores from the previous autumn were dwindling to their very last dregs, and the promise of the new growing season was still just that, a promise. Green and fragile dot, imagine the peasant larder in March. The great sack of grain, the cornerstone of their existence, is alarmingly light. The flour it yields is stale, perhaps even starting to go rancid or weevil-infested. The salted meat from the autumn slaughter, if they were lucky enough to have any, is gone. or what remains is leather tough and intensely salty. The dried peas and beans, the protein that sustained them through the winter, are down to the last handfuls scraped from the bottom of the pot. The winter storage vegetables like turnips and parsnips are woody and shriveled. The world outside the cottage door, though showing the first signs of life, offered little immediate sustenance. The fields were bare mud, newly plowed and sown, holding a future harvest that was still months away. The livestock that survived the winter were at their weakest and leanest. Cows, having endured months of poor quality fodder, were thin and not yet producing milk in any quantity until they had calved and could graze on new grass. It was a time of gnawing, empty-bellied hunger. This period of scarcity was perfectly and cruelly mirrored by the religious calendar of the church. Spring was the season of Lent, the 40 days of fasting leading up to Easter. For the nobility, Lent was a culinary challenge, an opportunity to display wealth through elaborate meals of expensive fish, almonds, and rice. For the peasant, it was a catastrophe. The Lenten fast forbade the consumption of all meat and all animal products, which included eggs, milk, butter, and cheese, the very calorie-dense foods that might have helped them survive the hungry gap. This prohibition on dairy, known as the white meats, was a devastating blow. That small trickle of milk from the family cow, the few eggs from their scrawny chickens, were now forbidden. The peasant was forced into a near-vegan diet at the very moment their body was crying out for fat and protein. So what did they eat to survive? The diet became a monotonous rotation of what was left and what could be found. The main meal was still pottage, but now it was a meager affair. The base would be the last of the dried peas and beans, boiled for hours into a mush. For flavor, they would use the last of the stored onions and garlic, and perhaps some stock made from boiling salted fish bones, if they had access to fish at all. Fish was the permitted food of Lent, but fresh fish was a luxury for those near the coast, or rivers with fishing rights. For most inland peasants, the only option was preserved fish, usually salted or wind-dried cod, stockfish, or salted herring, which were imported at great expense. A peasant family might be able to afford a small amount of salted herring, which they would have to soak for hours to make it palatable. The flavor would have been intensely salty, and it would have been used sparingly, more as a condiment to flavor the pottage than as a meal in itself. The other pillar of their diet, bread, became coarser and more desperate. If the wheat or rye flour was running low, it would be bulked out with anything available. Flour from oats, barley, or even dried peas and beans would be mixed in, creating a heavy, dense, and often sour-tasting loaf. In times of true famine, peasants were known to mix in tree bark, sawdust, or dirt just to fill their stomachs. With the cultivated land offering nothing, foraging became a matter of life and death. As soon as the first green shoots appeared, the peasant wife and her children would spend hours scouring the hedgerows, woods, and field margins. They were searching for pot herbs, anything green that could be added to the cauldron. Young nettles were a crucial resource. Picked carefully and boiled, they lose their sting and provide a nutritious iron-rich green, tasting much like spinach. Young dandelion leaves, chickweed, and wild garlic, also known as ramps, were other early arrivals, adding much-needed vitamins and a welcome burst of fresh, pungent flavor to the monotonous diet. These foraged greens were not a side dish. They were the main event, the bulk of the meal, cooked down in the pottage to provide some semblance of a filling meal. The hungry gap was a time of profound physical weakness. A diet of coarse bread and thin vegetable soup did not provide enough calories for the hard agricultural labor that spring demanded. Plowing the heavy, wet soil was back-breaking work, and the peasant would have undertaken it in a state of semi-starvation, burning more calories than he was consuming. This period of intense labor combined with poor nutrition made the population highly susceptible to disease and mortality rates, especially among the very young, and the elderly would have spiked in the spring. But spring, for all its hardship, was also a season of hope. The very act of foraging was an act of faith in the coming abundance. And slowly, painstakingly, the world would begin to provide. The first true sign of relief was often the calving of the cow. The birth of a calf meant the cow would once again start producing milk. This milk was a lifeline. Though forbidden during Lent itself, the moment Easter arrived, it became the most important food source. It was liquid protein and fat, a rich, life-giving substance that could be drunk fresh or turned into simple butter and soft, fresh cheeses. The chickens, too, would begin to lay more regularly as the days grew longer, and a clutch of eggs was a feast of unparalleled richness after the privations of Lent. The streams and rivers, swollen with spring meltwater, might offer up small fish, like eels or trout, for those with the rights or the courage to catch them. The first true harvest from the garden would be the tender shoots of green vegetables, like early peas, which could be eaten pod and all. These were precious, a taste of the summer to come. The hungry gap was a brutal filter, a yearly test of a family's foresight and fortitude. It was the meanest, most dangerous time, a season defined by annoying emptiness in the stomach, but also by a resilient hope, a desperate search for the first signs of green that promised survival for another year. Spring was a time of desperate hope. Summer was its glorious, if fleeting, fulfillment. From roughly late June through August, the medieval peasant experienced a period of relative abundance, a vibrant explosion of fresh food that stood in stark, wonderful contrast to the grim scarcity of the hungry gap. The world turned from brown to green, and the peasant's diet was transformed along with it. This was not a time of lavish feasting in the aristocratic sense, but a season of fresh flavors, nutritional recovery, and a crucial rebuilding of the body's strength for the immense labor that lay ahead. The engine of this summer bounty was the peasant's garden, the croft. The careful tending of the peasant wife now paid its dividends in a cascade of fresh produce. The pottage pot, once filled with bland, reconstituted dried goods, now simmered with a riot of color and flavor. Young, tender cabbages, fresh leeks, and pungent onions formed its base. The real stars, however, were the fresh legumes. Fava beans, known as broad beans, could be picked young and eaten fresh, a sweet, nutritious treat. Fresh green peas were a seasonal delicacy, a world away from their dried winter counterparts. The garden also yielded a variety of salad greens, or salads, as they were known. These were not complex salads in the modern sense, but simple collections of fresh leaves like lettuce, sorrel, and borage, often dressed with a little salt and perhaps a splash of verjuice, the sour juice of unripe grapes. These fresh greens provided a vital infusion of vitamins that had been sorely lacking in the winter and spring diet, helping to ward off diseases like scurvy and restore a sense of physical well-being. But the most significant dietary shift in the summer came from the animals. The livestock, now grazing on the lush grass of the common pastures, were in their prime. The cow, having calved in the spring, was now producing milk in abundance. This surplus of milk transformed the peasants' access to fat and protein. Fresh milk itself was drunk, especially by children and the elderly. More importantly, it was processed. Cream was skimmed off the top and churned into rich yellow butter. This was a true luxury, a pure, high-calorie fat that could be spread thickly on bread, enriching their diet in a way that had been impossible just a few months earlier. The remaining skim milk was not wasted. It was used to make simple, fresh cheeses. These soft, unripened cheeses, often called green cheeses, were a staple of the summer diet. They could be eaten within days of being made, providing a substantial source of protein. They were a common part of the peasant's mid-meal. Taken out into the fields, a hunk of cheese, a thick slice of dark bread, and a jug of ale was the classic plowman's lunch, a portable, calorie-dense meal to fuel a day of hard labor. The chickens, too, were laying eggs almost daily, another easily accessible source of high-quality protein. The great labor of early summer was haymaking. The meadows of the manor had to be mown to produce hay, the essential winter fodder for the lord's animals and the peasant's own livestock. This was a communal effort of immense intensity. The entire village, men and women, would work from sunrise to sunset with scythes and rakes under the hot summer sun. This was some of the most physically demanding work of the entire year, requiring a huge expenditure of calories. The lord of the manor often recognized this, and it was traditional for him to provide extra food and drink for his peasants during this boon work. These hay feasts were a highlight of the year. The lord might provide vast quantities of ale, and perhaps even fresh meat or fish, a rare treat. It was a pragmatic gesture as much as a generous one. A well-fed workforce was a more productive one. As summer wore on, the first fruits began to ripen, adding a welcome sweetness to the diet. Foraging shifted from a search for bitter greens to a hunt for sugar. The woods and hedgerows offered up wild strawberries, raspberries, and bilberries. These were a treat for the children and could be eaten fresh or mashed and added to pottage. For a touch of sweetness, early varieties of apples and pears would begin to ripen in the small orchards or on individual trees. While most were destined for the cider press in autumn, some would be eaten fresh, a crisp, juicy counterpoint to the savory diet. However, the image of a lazy, bountiful summer is misleading. It was a period of relentless work, and the abundance was fragile and temporary. Fresh produce had a short shelf life in a world without refrigeration. The milk had to be consumed or turned into butter and cheese quickly before it spoiled. The fresh vegetables had to be eaten before they wilted. Summer was a race against time, a brief window to consume fresh food before the great work of the harvest and the season of preservation began. This season also highlights the significant social and economic gap between the peasant and the lord. While the peasant was enjoying fresh beans and cheese, the lord's table was laden with a far greater variety The Lord had access to fresh meat from his dovecote, his fish ponds, and his herds. He could afford spices like pepper and ginger and sugar, an incredibly expensive imported luxury. His diet was a statement of power and global reach, while the peasant's diet, even at its summer best, was a direct and intimate reflection of the few acres of land he worked. The summer diet, in all its green and milky glory, was the fuel that prepared the peasant for the most critical and arduous task of the year, the autumn harvest, the great reckoning that would determine who would eat and who would starve in the cold months to come. Autumn was the pivot upon which the entire year turned. It was a season of frantic, back-breaking labor, a period of immense anxiety, and the ultimate source of all winter security. From roughly late August to November, the peasant's life was dominated by a series of critical, overlapping tasks, each one essential for surviving the coming darkness. This was the time of the grain harvest, the fruit harvest, and most importantly, the annual slaughter of livestock. Autumn was not a time of feasting. It was a time of processing and preservation, a desperate race to transform the fleeting bounty of summer into a stable food supply that could last until the next spring. The most important event of the entire year was the grain harvest. Grain was the absolute bedrock of the medieval diet, the primary source of calories for lord and peasant alike. A successful grain harvest meant survival. A failed one meant famine. The sight of the great open fields turning from green to gold would have filled the village with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The work was monumental. The Lord's reeve would declare the harvest officially open, and the entire community, men, women, and even older children, would mobilize for the boon work of bringing in the Lord's domain first. The primary tool for harvesting wheat and rye was the sickle, a short, curved blade that required the user to stoop or squat, cutting the stalks handful by handful. It was slow but efficient, minimizing the loss of precious grain heads. For oats and barley, which were less prone to shedding, the long-handled scythe could be used, a faster but less precise tool. The men would cut the grain, while the women, the binders, would follow behind, gathering the cut stalks into sheaves and tying them with twisted lengths of straw. These sheaves were then stood up in stoops to dry in the field before being transported to the Lord's great tithe barn. The work was relentless, lasting from the first light of dawn until the last glimmer of dusk, day after day, until the fields were cleared. Once the Lord's harvest was secure, the peasant family could turn to their own scattered strips. The same intense labor was repeated on a smaller scale, driven by a desperate personal urgency. Every dropped head of grain was a loss to the family larder. After the harvest was brought in, the poorest members of the community, often widows, were allowed the right of gleaning, walking the harvested fields to pick up any stray stalks or heads of grain that had been missed. This was a crucial form of charity, often the only way the most destitute could acquire enough grain to see them through the winter. The harvested grain was then threshed, usually on a hard-packed earthen floor in a barn. By beating it with a flail, 2 pieces of wood joined by a leather thong. This separated the grain from the stalk and the chaff. The grain was then stored in sacks or chests, vulnerable to damp, mold, and vermin, a source of constant anxiety throughout the winter. As the grain harvest concluded, the fruit harvest began. Apples were the most important fruit crop for the English peasant. While some would be stored for eating, the vast majority were destined for the cider press. Cider, along with ale, was a staple drink, a source of calories and hydration. The apples would be crushed, often in a stone trough using a heavy stone wheel turned by a horse or by hand, and the resulting pulp would be pressed to extract the juice, which was then fermented in barrels. In more southerly regions of Europe, grapes were harvested for wine. Pears were also grown and could be pressed for a drink called perry. Berries and other fruits like sloes and damsons were gathered from the hedgerows. Lacking expensive sugar, these would be preserved in honey or boiled down into thick fruit cheeses that would set solid and could be stored for months. But the most significant culinary event of the autumn, the one that would provide the peasant with his main source of meat and fat for the entire year, was the annual slaughter of livestock. Keeping animals over the winter was a huge drain on resources. Hay and fodder were in limited supply and were often reserved for the essential plow animals like oxen. Therefore, any animal that was not needed for breeding or labor, and which could not be supported over the winter, was slaughtered. This primarily meant the pigs. Throughout the year, the family pig had been fattened on household scraps, whey from cheese-making, and by foraging for acorns and beechnuts in the woods under the rite of pannage. By late autumn, it was ready. The slaughter of the family pig was a crucial and solemn event. It was a moment of immense gain, but also the loss of a familiar creature. Crucially, absolutely nothing was wasted. The pig was a walking larder, and every part of it was meticulously processed and preserved. The blood was carefully collected, mixed with oats, herbs, and fat, and stuffed into lengths of intestine to make black pudding, which would be one of the first things eaten. The offal, the liver, heart, and kidneys was also eaten fresh, as it could not be preserved. This period immediately after the slaughter was one of the few times a peasant family would eat fresh meat. The head would be boiled for hours with herbs until the meat fell off the bone, which was then set in a jelly made from the stock to create a delicacy known as brawn. The intestines were cleaned and used as sausage casings. The real prize, however, was the meat and the fat. The great sides of the pig were cured to make bacon and ham. This was done by rubbing them with large quantities of salt, which drew out the moisture and acted as a powerful preservative. The salted sides would then be hung high in the smoky rafters of the cottage, where the wood smoke would further cure them and add flavor. This bacon, hard and intensely salty, was the peasant's primary meat source for the next year. It would be used sparingly, a small piece flaked into the pottage to add a rich, savory flavor and precious fat. The fat itself was rendered down into lard, which was stored in pottery jars and used for cooking, for spreading on bread, or as a vital ingredient in preserving other foods that other animals might also be slaughtered. Old cows or oxen passed there, prime for plowing, would be killed. Their meat was tough and stringy, a far cry from modern beef. It would be heavily salted or dried to make a form of jerky. Old chickens, no longer laying well, would also end up in the pot. Autumn, therefore, was a season defined by a paradox. It was a time of immense, almost overwhelming production, but the goal was not immediate consumption. It was a frantic, high-stakes battle against decay. Every bushel of grain, every barrel of cider, Every side of bacon was a small victory against the looming threat of the winter, a down payment on survival. The fullness of the larder in November was the direct measure of a family's success and their only real hope for seeing the spring. Winter descended upon the medieval world not just as a season, but as a force. It was a time of deep, biting cold, of long, oppressive darkness, and of profound isolation. The vibrant green world of summer was a distant memory, replaced by a monochrome landscape of mud, frost, and bare trees. For the peasant family, winter was the ultimate test of the year's labor. Their survival now depended entirely on what they had managed to harvest, process, and preserve during the frantic days of autumn. The peasant's diet in winter was a diet of storage and scarcity, a monotonous but life-sustaining rhythm of bread. Pottage and hope. The rhythm of life slowed dramatically. With the fields frozen or waterlogged, the great communal agricultural tasks ceased. The long hours of darkness, with only the flickering light of the central hearth or a precious tallow candle to hold back the gloom, meant that outdoor work was limited. Life moved indoors. This was a time for crafts and repairs. The peasant would mend his tools, carve a new handle for his axe, or repair the wattle walls of his cottage. The wife would spend endless hours at her spindle and loom, spinning the wool from their sheep into thread and weaving it into coarse homespun cloth for the family's clothes. While less physically demanding than the harvest, this was a period of psychological endurance, a battle against boredom, cold, and the ever-present anxiety about the dwindling food stores, the cornerstone of the winter diet, more so than at any other time of year. Was bread. The grain harvested in autumn was the primary source of calories. The peasant's loaf was not the light, airy bread we know today. It was typically a heavy, dense bread made from a mixture of grains known as maslin. Rye was common, as it grew well in poor soils, but it could be susceptible to a fungal infection called ergot, which, if consumed, could cause a horrific condition known as St. Anthony's fire, leading to hallucinations, gangrene, and death. Barley and oat flour were also used, often mixed with pea or bean flour to extend the grain. This bread was their staff of life in the truest sense. It was eaten at every meal, a dense, chewy source of carbohydrates that filled the stomach and provided the energy to withstand the cold dot. The second pillar of the diet was the daily pottage, bubbling away in the single cauldron over the fire. In winter, the pottage was a thick, hearty stew, a testament to the autumn's preservation. The base was the dried legumes, peas, and beans soaked and boiled for hours. To this was added the stored vegetables from the garden, sliced turnips, parsnips, and hardy cabbages that could be kept for months in a cool corner. The real flavor and nutritional power of the winter pottage, however, came from the preserved pig. A small piece of the hard, salty bacon or a chunk of salt pork would be added to the pot. As it simmered, it would release its fat and intense savory flavor into the stew, enriching the entire meal. The meat itself would be used sparingly, shredded, and distributed among the family. A spoonful of lard might be added for extra calories, making the pottage a truly warming, fat-rich meal, essential for generating body heat. The flavors were strong and simple. The earthiness of the roots, the smokiness of the bacon, the pungency of the last of the stored onions and garlic, Dairy products, so abundant in the summer, were now scarce. The cow, if the family owned one, would be dry or producing very little milk, as it subsisted on meager hay. Any milk produced was too precious to be drunk freely, and might be saved for young children or the sick. The soft, fresh cheeses of summer were a distant memory. Now, they ate hard, aged cheeses, made from the summer surplus. These cheeses were intensely flavored and had a low moisture content, allowing them to be stored for many months. A small wedge of this hard cheese, eaten with their dark bread, was a common and protein-rich meal. Butter, too, was a preserved product, heavily salted and packed into earthenware pots. What about fresh food? It was almost non-existent. Foraging was impossible in the frozen landscape. The garden was dormant. This lack of fresh greens and fruits meant the peasant's diet was severely deficient in certain vitamins, particularly vitamin C. While not as acute as in the hungry gap of spring, the risk of scurvy and other deficiency diseases would have increased. As winter wore on despite the monotony, winter was not without its moments of celebration. The bleakest part of the year was punctuated by the most important festival, Christmas. The 12 days of Christmas, from Christmas Day to Epiphany, were a legally recognized holiday. The Lord's work stopped, and for a brief period the peasant was master of his own time. This was the one time of year when a peasant family might allow themselves to feast. They would bake a special, better quality bread, perhaps with more rye or even some precious wheat flour. They would consume a larger portion of their stored meat. A small ham might be boiled or sausages cooked. A special, stronger Christmas ale would have been brewed. It was also a time of communal celebration. The lord of the manor would often hold a Christmas feast for his tenants, a grand affair in the manor hall, with a roaring fire, copious food, and ale. This was not just generosity. It was a powerful social ritual that reinforced the bonds of the community and the benevolent authority of the Lord. The peasant might even be allowed to bring his own plate and take home the leftovers, a rare bounty. Another important winter product was ale. Brewing was a winter activity undertaken by the ale wives of the village once the harvest was in and the grain was available. The process was simple. Barley was malted by allowing it to sprout and then heating it to stop germination. This malt was then mashed with hot water, and the resulting sweet liquid, the wort, was boiled, often with herbs like horehound or allihu for flavor. Hops were not widely used in England until later in the Middle Ages. Yeast was added, and the mixture was left to ferment. The resulting ale was thick, nutritious, and cloudy, often called liquid bread. It was a vital source of calories and B vitamins, and importantly, it was much safer to drink than water, which was often contaminated. Everyone, including children, drank ale, though the children's version would have been a weaker, small ale. As winter dragged on, the stores would begin to dwindle. The salted meat would be consumed, the hard cheeses eaten, and the sacks of grain would feel lighter each week. The monotony of the diet, bread, pottage, ale, repeat, would have been psychologically taxing. The end of winter was a race. The family had to make their stored food last until the first signs of life returned in the spring, the beginning of the hungry gap. Winter survival was the ultimate measure of a peasant's worth as a farmer and a household manager. It was a season of endurance, a long, dark wait fueled by the preserved riches of autumn and the simple, desperate hope for the eventual return of the sun. Of all the foods that sustained the medieval peasant, none was more important, more spiritually significant, or more politically charged than bread. It was far more than simple nutrition. It was the literal staff of life, the fundamental currency of calories upon which their entire world was built. The quality, color, and grain of a peasant's loaf was a direct reflection of their social standing, the fertility of their land, and the time of year. The journey of bread from a seed in the ground to a dense slice on the trencher was a journey. Through the heart of the manorial economy, a process steeped in obligation, anxiety, and communal ritual. For the peasant, bread was not just food. It was the very measure of their existence. The medieval world was, at its core, a grain-based society. While we have discussed pottage, ale, and meat, it was carbohydrates from grain that provided the vast majority, perhaps up to 80% of the daily caloric intake for the common person. This reliance on grain created a hierarchy of cereals that was understood by everyone. At the absolute apex of this hierarchy was wheat. Wheat flour, with its high gluten content, produced a light, airy, and pale-colored loaf. This white bread, known as Pandemonian or Lord's bread, was the ultimate status symbol. It was soft, easily digestible, and, due to the intensive labor and high-quality soil required to grow wheat, incredibly expensive. It was the bread of the aristocracy, the clergy, and the wealthy merchant class. A peasant might taste true white bread only once or twice a year, perhaps as a special treat from the Lord at a Christmas feast. Its paleness was a sign of purity and luxury, a foodstuff that required no hard chewing, and proclaimed the eater's freedom from manual labor. The peasant's daily bread was a world away from this aristocratic ideal. It was dark, heavy, and dense. The most common bread grain for a peasant of reasonable means was rye. Rye was a hardy, resilient grain that could thrive in the poor, acidic soils and harsher climates where wheat would fail. It had a strong, earthy flavor and produced a dark, sticky, and often dense loaf. While nutritious, rye had a dark side. It was particularly susceptible to a fungus called ergot, Claviceps purpurea, which grew on the grain in wet conditions. Consuming ergot-infected rye could lead to a horrific condition known as ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire. Sufferers experienced terrifying symptoms, vivid hallucinations, severe convulsions, and a burning sensation in the limbs caused by restricted blood flow, which often led to gangrene, causing fingers, toes, and even entire limbs to blacken and fall off. A wet autumn could turn the staff of life into a deadly poison dot, more common than a pure rye loaf. However, was a mixed grain bread called maslin. The word comes from the old French messeler, meaning to mix. Peasants would often sow their strips of land with a mixture of wheat and rye. This was a form of agricultural insurance. In a good year, the wheat would do well. In a poor year, the hardier rye would still provide a harvest. The resulting blended flour produced a bread that was lighter than pure rye, but darker and coarser than pure wheat, a perfect metaphor for the peasant's intermediate status above the truly destitute. Below maslin on the social scale was the bread of the poorest cotters and laborers. This was often made from barley or oats, grains more commonly associated with animal fodder and ale making. These grains have very little gluten, and the resulting bread was a heavy, flat, coarse cake that was difficult to digest and seen as a sign of true poverty. In times of famine, as we have seen, this would be bulked out with pea flour, bean flour, or even less savory ingredients, creating what was disparagingly called horse bread. The color of your bread was a direct advertisement of your place in the world. The process of turning this grain into bread was a journey through the Lord's monopolies. After the autumn harvest and the arduous process of threshing with flails, the peasant family had their store of grain. They could not simply grind this at home. Small, hand-powered rotary querns existed, but their use was often forbidden by the Lord to protect the profitability of his mill. So the peasant had to haul his sacks of grain to the manorial mill, a journey that could take hours. Here he waited in line with his neighbors, exchanging gossip and complaints before facing the miller. The miller, empowered by his monopoly, would take his payment, the multure, from the peasant's flour. The peasant, often illiterate and unable to challenge the miller's measurements, could only watch with suspicion as his precious food supply was diminished. Once home, the flour was handed over to the peasant wife. It was her task to knead the dough, a physically demanding process of working the heavy flour with water, salt, and a leavening agent. This leavening was usually a piece of sourdough starter saved from the previous batch, a living, yeasty culture that had to be kept alive and nurtured. The kneaded dough would then be shaped into large, round loaves called cobes, but the process was still not complete. Matilda, our peasant wife, could not bake this dough in her own cottage. The risk of fire from private ovens in a village of thatched roof huts was a genuine concern, but the primary reason for the ban was, as always, the Lord's profit. The village had a communal oven built of stone or clay, owned and operated by the Lord. Matilda would have to carry her family's dough to the Lord's baker, where she would pay another fee for the privilege of baking. This system created a communal rhythm to village life with specific baking days where all the women would congregate at the oven, a place of social interaction, but also another reminder of their shared dependency. The loaves they produced were large, designed to last for several days. Fresh bread was a rarity. Most days the family ate bread that was 1, 2, or even 3 days old, becoming progressively harder and staler. This stale bread was not wasted. It was the key to another aspect of medieval dining, the trencher. As we've seen, the trencher was a thick slab of old bread that functioned as an edible plate. The word comes from the old French trencher, to cut. A large loaf would be cut horizontally, and the thick, flat slices from the center would serve as trenchers. The thick pottage or any pieces of solid food were served directly onto this bread plate. The bread would absorb the juices and flavors of the meal. For the peasant, the trencher was a clever way of ensuring no food was wasted. At the end of the meal, the juice-soaked bread was a delicious, calorie-rich bonus. It could be eaten by the diner, given to a servant or a child, or, in an act of pious charity, given to the poor who might be waiting at the gate. This use of bread as a plate highlights its absolute centrality. It was not just an accompaniment to the meal. It was part of the very fabric of the meal itself. Bread also played a crucial role in the peasant's faith. It was, of course, central to the Christian sacrament of the Eucharist. where bread and wine were consecrated to become the body and blood of Christ. This imbued the substance with a profound spiritual significance. To waste bread was not just economically foolish, it was seen as a sin. Dropping a piece of bread on the floor was an act of carelessness that required an apology to God. Superstitions abounded. It was believed that bread baked on Good Friday had curative powers and would never go moldy. A cross was often cut into the top of a loaf before baking, not just to control its rising, but as a blessing, a way of marking this most essential food as a gift from God, from the type of grain grown in the fields to the color of the final loaf, from the communal ritual of the village oven to its sacred role in the Mass. Bread was woven into every aspect of peasant life. It represented their toil, their social status, their dependency on the Lord, and their faith in God. It was the food that fueled their labor, filled their bellies, and connected them to their community and their cosmos. The humble, heavy, dark loaf of the medieval peasant was truly the staff of their life. In the modern world, we think of water as the purest, most essential drink, the foundation of a healthy diet. For the medieval peasant, this was far from the case. In a world without sanitation systems, water was a source of constant danger. Rivers and streams were often contaminated with human and animal waste, carrying invisible diseases like dysentery and cholera that could sicken or kill. While a peasant might drink from a clean, fast-flowing spring or a well-guarded well, they were rightly suspicious of most water sources. For this reason, the primary beverage of the medieval world, the liquid that hydrated the population, fueled their labor, and lubricated their social lives, was not water. It was ale. To the modern palate, the word ale might conjure up images of a clear, bitter, hoppy craft beer. The ale of the medieval peasant was something entirely different. It was thick, cloudy, and nutritious, often called liquid bread, and for good reason. It was a soupy, porridge-like brew, low in alcohol content, but high in calories and essential nutrients. It was consumed by everyone, men, women, and even children, from morning until night. It was safer than water, more calorific than bread, alone and a vital component of the peasant diet, providing a significant portion of their daily energy intake. The medieval world was a drinker's world, and ale was its lifeblood. The production of ale was a cornerstone of the peasant household economy, and it was a domain almost exclusively controlled by women. The alewife or brewster was a familiar and respected figure in every village. Brewing was a complex and skilled process that transformed the hard-won grain from the harvest into a safe and nourishing drink. The first step was malting. Barley was the preferred grain for brewing, though oats, wheat, or a mixture of grains could also be used. The grain was steeped in water until it began to germinate or sprout. This process activated enzymes within the grain that began to convert the complex starches into simpler fermentable sugars. Just as the sprouts appeared, the process was halted by heating the grain, usually in a kiln or over a low fire. This resulted in malt, a sweet, nutty-tasting grain that was the soul of the ale. The malt was then coarsely ground, and the resulting grist was mixed with hot water in a large vessel, often the same all-purpose cauldron used for making pottage. This process, known as mashing, allowed the enzymes to complete their work, creating a sweet, sugary liquid called wort. The wort was then drained off and boiled. This boiling process served two purposes. It sterilized the liquid, killing any harmful bacteria, and it allowed for the addition of flavorings. It is important to note that for most of the medieval period, particularly in England, hops were not used in brewing. Hops, with their bitter flavor and powerful preservative qualities, were a continental innovation that only became widespread later. Instead, the alewife would use a complex and varied mixture of herbs and spices known as gruel. The exact composition of gruel varied from region to region and brewer to brewer, but common ingredients included bog myrtle, yarrow, horehound, and heather. These herbs added flavor and aroma, but they lacked the preservative power of hops, meaning that medieval ale had a very short shelf life and had to be consumed within a few days of being made. After boiling, the wort was cooled and transferred to fermentation vats, which could be large wooden tubs or pottery vessels. The magic of fermentation was then initiated. The alewife would add yeast, a substance they understood through practice rather than science. They would often use a special stirring stick that harbored its own yeast culture, or they would skim the frothy yeast from a previous successful batch. The yeast would go to work, consuming the sugars in the wort and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. After a few days of vigorous bubbling, the fermentation would slow, and the ale would be ready. The resulting beverage was not filtered or clarified. It was a thick, soupy, opaque brew, full of suspended yeast and grain particles. It was incredibly nutritious, rich in B vitamins from the yeast, which were often lacking in the rest of the diet. The peasant household would produce several different grades of ale from a single mash. The first liquid drained off the mash, the richest in sugars, would produce the strong ale. This was the best quality brew, with a higher alcohol content, reserved for the man of the house, for special occasions, or for selling to earn extra income. Subsequent rinsings of the same mash with more water would produce a weaker brew, known as small ale or small beer. This was the everyday drink, with an alcohol content likely similar to a modern soft drink. It was this small ale that was consumed by women and children throughout the day. It provided hydration and calories without causing significant intoxication, making it the perfect beverage to drink while working in the fields. Ale was not just a drink. It was a social institution. While much brewing was done for domestic consumption, many alewives would brew larger batches for sale. The sign of an alehouse was simple. A long pole or branch, known as an ale stake, would be hung out from the ale house to signify that a fresh batch was ready. The alehouse was a peasant's social club, a place to gather after a hard day's work, to exchange news, gossip, and complaints, to play games, and to forge community bonds. It was often viewed with suspicion by the authorities, both secular and religious, who saw it as a breeding ground for idleness, sedition, and sin. The manorial court rolls are filled with cases of alewives being fined for breaking the assize of ale regulations governing the price and quality of the brew. Common offenses included charging too much, using false measures, or serving weak or sour ale. Despite this official disapproval, the alehouse remained the vibrant center of village social life. The caloric importance of ale cannot be overstated. A medieval peasant performing hard agricultural labor could burn upwards of 3,500 to 4,000 calories a day. It was difficult to consume this much energy for bread and pottage alone. Ale helped to bridge this gap. Historians estimate that a peasant might have consumed as much as a gallon of ale per day. While this sounds like a staggering amount, we must remember that most of it was weak, small ale. This daily gallon could have provided anywhere from a quarter to a third of their total caloric intake. It was, in a very real sense, a liquid meal. The contrast with water is stark. While a pristine well or a fast-moving upland stream might provide safe drinking water, these were not always available. Most lowland villages relied on rivers or ponds that were often contaminated. The process of making ale, boiling the wort effectively, pasteurized the beverage, killing the dangerous pathogens that cause waterborne diseases like typhoid and cholera. Choosing to drink ale over water was a rational, life-saving decision. It provided calories, vitamins, and most importantly, a degree of safety from the invisible microbial threats that lurked in the water supply. In a world fraught with peril, the cloudy, nutritious, and slightly alcoholic comfort of a jug of ale was one of the peasants' most reliable and cherished sources of life. It was the fuel of medieval England, a drink that was safer than water, more social than pottage, and as fundamental to survival as bread itself. The diet of the medieval peasant was, as we have seen, overwhelmingly based on cereals and vegetables. Meat was a rare luxury, a ghost that haunted the simmering pottage with a sliver of salted bacon or a boiled-down bone. The vast majority of a peasant's protein came from legumes, dairy, and eggs. Yet all around them, in the woodlands, forests, and rivers of the manor, was a world teeming with fresh meat. Herds of deer, wild boar with their fearsome tusks, scurrying rabbits, and plump pheasants filled the forests. The rivers flashed with the silver of salmon and trout. This was an entire ecosystem of high-quality protein, a locked larder sitting just beyond the peasant's grasp. Access to this larder was forbidden, protected by a set of brutally enforced laws designed to preserve it for the exclusive pleasure of the aristocracy. To partake in this forbidden feast was to commit the crime of poaching, an act of defiance that promised the ultimate culinary reward, but carried the gravest of risks. The legal foundation for this prohibition was the Forest Law, introduced to England in its harshest form by William the Conqueror and the Normans. The Forest Law was a separate legal system that applied to vast tracts of the country, perhaps as much as a third of England at its height. A royal forest was not necessarily a dense woodland. It was a legal designation for any land including forests, heaths, pastures, and even entire villages where the king's rights over game, particularly deer, were paramount. These were the king's personal hunting preserves. Within the bounds of the forest, the rights of the common peasant were severely curtailed. He might have the right to graze his pigs or gather fallen wood, but the animals themselves belonged to the king or the nobleman to whom he had granted the rights. The primary purpose of the Forest Law was to protect the beasts of the chase, especially the red and fallow deer, which were seen as the ultimate quarry for the aristocratic hunt, a sport that was both a pleasure and a vital form of military training. The punishments for breaking the Forest Law were draconian and designed to inspire terror. This was not a matter for the local manorial court. It was adjudicated by special and much feared forest courts. To be caught killing a deer was a capital crime. A poacher could be hanged or, in some earlier periods, blinded and castrated. Even lesser offenses carried savage penalties. A man caught with a bow and arrow within the forest, a clear sign of intent, could have his hand chopped off. Peasants living within the forest were even forbidden from fencing their own land in a way that might impede the free movement of the deer. They were required to law their dogs, a brutal process of cutting the pads or tendons of their paws to prevent them from being able to chase game. The law was a constant, intimidating presence, a clear and brutal statement that the hunger of a peasant was insignificant compared to the sporting pleasure of a king. Despite these terrifying risks, the temptation was often too great to resist. The allure of poaching was twofold. Firstly, it offered an immediate and substantial source of high-quality food. A single deer could provide a huge quantity of fresh venison, a meat so lean and flavorful it was almost mythical to the common person. It represented a massive windfall of protein and fat that could feed a family for weeks. In a world where meat consumption was rare and intermittent, the prospect of a haunch of venison roasting over a secret fire was an almost irresistible dream. Rabbits, which lived in managed warrens known as conygarths, were also the property of the Lord, but were a frequent target of poachers. They were easier to catch and conceal than a deer, and a few rabbits could make a substantial and delicious addition to the pottage pot. The rivers, too, were protected. The rights to fish for valuable species like salmon and trout belonged to the local lord or monastery. A peasant caught using a net or a trap in the lord's stream could be fined heavily or placed in the stocks. Secondly, poaching was an act of social rebellion. It was a direct defiance of the lord's authority, a way of reclaiming a small portion of the natural world's bounty that the peasant felt was his by right. The popular ballads and stories of the Middle Ages are filled with heroic poachers, most famously the legendary figure of Robin Hood. In the Tales, Robin and his merry men feast on the king's deer in Sherwood Forest, an act that is portrayed as both a source of physical sustenance and a symbol of their freedom from unjust laws. These stories reflect a deep-seated popular resentment against the forest laws. To the peasant, the deer that ate his crops and the boar that trampled his fields were a nuisance, and the laws that protected these destructive animals, while humans went hungry, seemed a profound injustice. Poaching, therefore, was not just about filling an empty stomach. It was a small, dangerous act of social warfare. The methods of the poacher had to be silent, clever, and easily concealable. The classic image of a poacher with a longbow is largely a romantic fiction. A longbow was a military weapon, large, conspicuous, and loud. A poacher was more likely to use a snare, a simple loop of cord or wire, which could be set on a game, trail and left unattended. It was silent, effective, and if discovered, it was not immediately obvious who had set it. Traps, such as deadfalls that used a heavy log to crush an animal, were also used. For fishing, a peasant might use a baited line, a small, easily hidden net, or even resort to tickling trout by hand in the shallows. Another method was to use a trained dog, a lurcher, a crossbreed known for its speed and silence. to catch a rabbit or a hare and bring it back swiftly. The consequences of a successful poaching expedition were immediate. The first challenge was butchering and hiding the evidence. A deer was a large animal, and its slaughter and dressing had to be done quickly and secretly, often at night. The hide, antlers, and any parts that could not be eaten had to be buried or disposed of where the Lord's forester would not find them. The meat would be a cause for celebration, but a quiet one. A family suddenly feasting on fresh venison would arouse immediate suspicion from their neighbors. The meat had to be consumed discreetly or quickly preserved by smoking or salting. The poacher lived in constant fear of a jealous neighbor or a prying village official who might report them in exchange for a reward or favor from the Lord. The poacher was a figure of ambiguity in the village community. On one hand, he was a hero, a risk-taker who provided a source of communal good. He might share his illicit catch with his neighbors, especially other poor families, earning him respect and loyalty. His actions would be protected by a conspiracy of silence. On the other hand, he was a source of danger to the entire community. If a Lord's forester discovered evidence of poaching but could not identify the culprit, the Lord could levy a heavy collective fine on the entire village. This meant that one man's gain could lead to another man's ruin, creating deep tensions that the intensity of the forest law waxed and waned. After the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, which included clauses that limited the king's ability to create new forests and slightly reduced the severity of the punishments, the laws became somewhat less oppressive. But the fundamental principle remained. The wild animals of the land belonged to the powerful. The struggle over these resources never truly ended. It represents the most fundamental conflict in the peasant's culinary world, the clash between the natural abundance of the land and the artificial scarcity created by the law. The forbidden feast of the poacher is a testament to the peasant's ingenuity, his courage, and his deep-seated belief that the earth and its creatures should provide sustenance for all, not just sport for the rich. It was a dangerous gamble, where the stake was a full belly and the price of failure was mutilation or death. The daily diet of the medieval peasant was, as we have explored, a monotonous but carefully managed cycle of bread, pottage, and ale. It was a diet of survival, designed to provide enough energy for a life of hard labor. However, this baseline of subsistence was punctuated by dramatic and sometimes violent swings between two extremes: the communal joy of the feast and the devastating, all-consuming terror of famine. These were the two poles of the peasant's culinary experience. The feast was a temporary sanctioned escape from the everyday, a moment of shared abundance that reinforced social bonds. Famine was the ultimate failure of the system, a catastrophic collapse of the food supply that revealed the brutal fragility of their existence. To understand the peasant's relationship with food, we must understand both these moments of rare plenty and of terrifying scarcity. Feasting in the medieval world was deeply intertwined with the Christian calendar. The year was marked out by a series of holy days or holidays, which were the only times the peasant was released from his labor obligations. The most significant of these was Christmas, the 12 days of Christmas, from December 25th to Epiphany. On January 6th represented the longest break from work in the entire year. It was a time of celebration that stood in stark defiance to the cold and darkness of the midwinter. The peasant family would allow themselves to consume a larger portion of their precious winter stores. A special, better quality bread might be baked, perhaps with a higher proportion of rye or even a little wheat. The Christmas ale, brewed stronger and richer than the usual small ale, would be broached. But the centerpiece of the Christmas celebration was meat. The family might boil a small ham from the autumn pig slaughter, or cook up some of the sausages they had so carefully preserved. This was a rare indulgence, a conscious decision to consume a significant amount of their winter protein in a short burst of celebration. The Christmas feast was not just a private family affair. It was a crucial social ritual, often centered on the lord of the manor. It was traditional for the lord to hold a Christmas feast in the great hall of his manor house for all of his tenants. This was a powerful display of his wealth and his role as the benevolent patriarch of the community. The peasants would be seated at long trestled tables, the hall decorated with winter greenery, a massive Yule log blazing in the hearth. The Lord would provide vast quantities of food and drink, far more than any peasant could afford. There would be vats of strong ale, platters of beef and mutton, pies filled with game, and perhaps even imported wine. This feast served a dual purpose. For the peasant, it was a moment of genuine joy and a welcome respite from their meager diet. But it was also a powerful tool of social control for the Lord. By providing this bounty, he reinforced his status, demonstrated his generosity, and placed his tenants in a state of gratitude, reminding them that their well-being ultimately depended on his goodwill. The custom often allowed peasants to take home leftovers, a precious bonus for their own larders. Other major feasts punctuated the year. Easter marked the joyous end of the long Lenten fast. The return of eggs and dairy to the diet was a feast in itself. Families would eat decorated hard-boiled eggs, a symbol of new life. Whitsun, 50 days after Easter, was another major holiday, often celebrated with outdoor fairs, Morris dancing, and, of course, feasting and drinking. Even the agricultural calendar had its celebratory meals. We have seen the hay feasts provided by the Lord during the haymaking. A similar tradition, the harvest home, marked the end of the grain harvest. The last sheaf of grain was brought in with great ceremony, and the Lord would host another feast to thank the villagers for their labor. These moments of collective feasting were vital. They were bright spots of color in a largely monochrome existence, moments that affirmed community, reaffirmed the social hierarchy, and provided a psychological release from the daily grind. But if the feast was the dream, famine was the ever-present nightmare. The medieval food supply was precarious, utterly dependent on the weather. A society that relied on a single annual grain harvest was always just one bad season away from catastrophe. Too much rain in the summer could cause the grain to rot in the fields or be infected with fungus like ergot. A prolonged drought could wither the crops, leading to a tiny, meager yield. An early frost could kill the ripening grain. When the harvest failed, the consequences were swift and horrific. The most infamous example of this was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. A period of unusually cold and wet weather led to catastrophic crop failures across northern Europe for several years in a row. The price of grain skyrocketed. putting it far beyond the reach of the poor. The peasants' own stores were quickly exhausted, and there was nothing to replace them. The chronicles of the time paint a truly apocalyptic picture. People first resorted to eating their seed grain, a desperate act that consumed the only hope for the following year's crop. Then they ate their dogs, cats, and horses. The social order broke down. Starving bands of people roamed the countryside, willing to kill for a crust of bread. There are chilling and well-documented accounts of cannibalism, of parents abandoning their children, of the dead lying unburied in the streets. The Great Famine may have killed between 10 and 15% of the population of Northern Europe, a devastating blow that weakened the population for decades, and was a dark prelude to the even greater catastrophe of the Black Death a generation later. Even a localized famine could be devastating. The manorial system, while providing some security, was also a trap. Peasants were tied to the land, unable to move to regions where the harvest might have been better. The infrastructure for transporting bulk goods like grain over long distances was poor and expensive, meaning that one region could be suffering from a severe famine, while another, just 100 miles away, might have a surplus. The lord of the manor had no formal obligation to feed his tenants during a famine, while some might have released grain from their own stores out of a sense of Christian charity or simple pragmatism. Dead peasants could not work his fields. Others would hoard their grain or sell it at inflated prices, profiting from the misery of their people. During a famine, the peasant's diet evolved into a desperate search for anything that could provide calories. The already meager pottage became a thin gruel of water, and whatever could be found. They would dig up roots from the forest, eat tree bark, acorns, and grass. The social hierarchy of food was thrown into sharp relief. The rich, with their stored wealth and access to imported goods, could survive, while the poor, who lived hand to mouth, were the first to perish. Famine was the ultimate expression of the peasants' powerlessness. It was a stark reminder that their lives were balanced on the edge of a sickle and at the mercy of the clouds. These two extremes, the feast and the famine, framed the peasant's life. The feast was a glimpse of a world of abundance, a taste of the security and pleasure that the aristocracy enjoyed as their birthright. It was a vital social glue, a release valve for the pressures of their hard existence. The famine was the abyss that was always waiting just below their feet. It stripped away all social pretense and reduced life to its most brutal biological essence. The average peasant lived their entire life in the vast space between these two poles, in a state of perpetual food anxiety, skillfully managing their limited resources in the hope of enjoying the next feast, and above all, avoiding the next famine. In the autumn of 1347, a dozen Genoese trading galleys limped into the port of Messina, Sicily. They brought with them not just silks and spices, but a silent, invisible passenger that would tear the medieval world apart. This was the arrival of the Black Death, a pandemic of bubonic plague that in less than 5 years would kill between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's entire population. It was a catastrophe of unimaginable scale, a biological holocaust that spared no one. But in the wake of this immense tragedy, as the survivors stepped out into a quieter, emptier world, they discovered that the fundamental rules that had governed Their lives and their diet for centuries had been profoundly and irrevocably changed. The Black Death was a demographic earthquake, and its aftershocks would create a surprising and unprecedented new world of food for the common peasant. Immediate aftermath of the plague was a scene of chaos and dereliction. The sheer scale of the death toll had shattered the manorial system. Fields lay unplowed, harvests rotted where they stood, and livestock roamed untended. Entire villages were abandoned, their cottages standing empty as silent monuments to the dead. For the survivors, however, this devastation created a grim but extraordinary opportunity. For the first time in centuries, the two most valuable commodities in the medieval world, land and labor, were completely revalued. Before the plague, Europe was overpopulated. There was a surplus of people and a scarcity of land. This had given the land-owning lords an immense advantage, allowing them to suppress wages and enforce the strict obligations of serfdom. After the plague, the situation was reversed. Now there was a surplus of land and a severe scarcity of labor. A lord might have vast tracts of fertile demesne land, but with half his workforce dead, he had no one to plow, sow, or harvest it. Suddenly the humble peasant, the survivor, was in a position of unprecedented bargaining power. Lords, desperate to have their fields worked, were forced to compete for tenants and laborers. They began to offer incentives that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. They offered higher wages for hired laborers, sometimes double or triple the pre-plague rates. For their serfs, they were forced to lower rents, reduce, or eliminate labor services and commute the old feudal dues into fixed, predictable cash payments. The balance of power had shifted dramatically. If a lord refused to meet these new demands, his peasants might simply flee to a neighboring manor where the lord was offering better terms. With the old social order in tatters and the population so depleted, a runaway serf was far more likely to find a new home and a new life. This new economic reality had a profound impact on what the surviving peasants ate. The most significant change was a dramatic increase in the consumption of meat and animal products. With so much arable land left vacant, many lords abandoned the intensive labor of grain farming and converted their lands to pasture for sheep and cattle, which required far fewer workers. This led to a surge in the availability of livestock. At the same time, the peasants' own newfound prosperity, either from higher wages or from inheriting the land of deceased relatives, allowed them to afford more and better food. More peasants could now afford to keep more animals. The family pig became more common, and a peasant might even own several. They could afford to keep their cows and sheep rather than selling them off. The result was a golden age for the medieval laborer. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a significant increase in the height and health of the average peasant, a direct result of a richer, more protein-heavy diet. They ate more beef, mutton, and pork than their ancestors had ever dreamed. The pottage pot was now regularly enriched with fresh meat, not just the salty scraps of preserved bacon. The consumption of dairy products also soared. More pasture land meant more and healthier cows, which meant more milk. Butter and cheese, once seasonal luxuries, became staples of the diet. The peasants' bread also improved in quality. With higher wages, they could afford to buy better quality grains. More land was given over to growing barley, not just for animal fodder, but for brewing vast quantities of ale. The post-plague era was a time of prodigious drinking, a way of enjoying newfound prosperity and perhaps forgetting past traumas. The diet became richer, more varied, and higher in protein and fat. This period also saw a shift in the peasants' relationship with the land. The old, rigid open-field system began to break down. Enterprising peasants, now with more land and freedom, began to enclose their holdings, consolidating their scattered strips into more efficient, privately managed farms. This allowed for greater innovation and specialization. A peasant might choose to focus on raising livestock, running a dairy, or growing vegetables for the market in a nearby town. This created a new class of prosperous yeoman farmers, the proud, independent figures who would become central to the English national identity. The psychological impact of the plague also changed how people thought about food and life. For the survivors, life was precious and unpredictable. This led to what some historians have called a new hedonism, a desire to enjoy the fruits of their labor in the here and now. They spent their higher wages not just on better food, but on better clothing, household goods, and leisure. The authorities, the old aristocracy, were horrified by this new assertiveness. They saw a world turned upside down, where the lower orders were no longer content with their divinely appointed station. In response, governments passed sumptuary laws, detailed regulations that attempted to control what people of different social classes could wear and eat. These laws prescribed the number of dishes a laborer was allowed to eat at a meal and forbade them from wearing expensive fabrics like silk. These laws were almost impossible to enforce and were widely flouted, but they revealed the deep anxiety of the elite in the face of a rising and more prosperous common class. However, this golden age was not to last forever. The elite pushed back. Landlords and governments, seeing their profits and social control eroding, attempted to reimpose the old order. In England, the Statute of Laborers of 1351 tried to fix wages at pre-plague levels and restrict the movement of peasants. These repressive measures led to widespread resentment and social unrest, culminating in the Great Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a massive uprising that, for a time, threatened to topple the entire social structure of England. Although the revolt was brutally suppressed, the underlying economic forces could not be denied. Serfdom as a widespread institution was dead in England. The feudal world of obligation was slowly giving way to a more modern world of cash, contracts, and markets. The Black Death was an unparalleled tragedy, a dark chasm in the heart of the Middle Ages. But from this chasm of death and despair, a new society emerged. For the common peasant who survived, it brought about a fundamental and lasting improvement in their standard of living and their diet. It shattered the rigid bonds of serfdom, empowered the laborer, and put more meat, dairy, and ale on their tables than at any other time in the medieval period. It was a world born of immense sorrow, but for a few generations, it was a world where the humble peasant for the first time had enough to eat. We have explored the peasant's diet as a product of the manorial system and the turning of the seasons. But there was a third immense power that dictated what a peasant could and could not eat, a power that governed their spiritual metabolism as much as their physical one. This was the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. Through its intricate and demanding calendar of feasts and fasts, the Church imposed a spiritual framework upon the peasant's plate, transforming the very act of eating into a constant negotiation with God. For nearly half the days of the year, the peasant's diet was subject to religious law. The choice was not between pork and beef, but between sin and salvation, and the kitchen cauldron became an arena where the great drama of Christian faith was played out daily. The theological foundation for this system was the concept of mortifying the flesh. In medieval Christian thought, the body and its appetites were a source of constant temptation, a battleground for the soul. Gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins, and controlling the urge to eat was seen as a powerful form of spiritual discipline, a way of purifying the soul by denying the base desires of the body. Food, particularly rich, blood-hot meat, was associated with lust, aggression, and worldly indulgence. Fasting, therefore, was a way to commemorate Christ's suffering, to atone for one's sins, and to strengthen the spirit against temptation. This ideology was not an abstract concept. It was enforced through a complex calendar that every peasant knew intimately. The greatest and most formidable of these periods was Lent, the Great Fast, or Quadragesima, lasting for 40 days, not including Sundays, from Ash Wednesday to Easter. Sunday it commemorated Christ's 40 days of fasting in the desert. For the aristocracy, Lent was a culinary showcase, a time to demonstrate their wealth by substituting meat with extravagant displays of expensive sea fish, elaborate marzipan, sculptures, and rice-based dishes. For the peasant, it was a nutritional disaster that coincided perfectly with the Hungry Gap, the time when their food stores were already at their lowest. The rules of Lent were severe. The primary prohibition was against eating any meat from land animals. But the fast went further, forbidding the consumption of all animal products, the lactocenia. This included milk, butter, cheese, and most cruelly, eggs. This prohibition on the white meats was devastating. The peasant family's scrawny chickens might just be starting to lay again as the days grew longer, but these precious eggs were forbidden. The family cow, if she had calved, was producing milk, but this life-giving source of fat and protein was now off limits. The peasant was forced onto a near-vegan diet, supplemented only by fish at the very moment when their body, weakened by the winter, desperately needed these nutrients to perform the hard labor of spring plowing. The Lenten pottage became a thin, meager affair based on the last of the dried beans and flavored with onions and foraged greens. Their bread, already coarse, seemed even more so without a sliver of lard or a smear of butter to soften it. Fish was the great Lenten exception, but for the vast majority of peasants living inland, fresh fish was an impossible luxury. Their access to fish was almost entirely through the preserved fish trade, a massive international industry. The most common was the herring, the king of fish, caught in huge numbers in the North Sea and the Baltic, then heavily salted and packed into barrels. A peasant family might be able to afford a few of these intensely salty red herrings, which they would have to soak for hours to make them remotely palatable before adding them to the pottage. The other great staple was stockfish, typically cod, which had been caught and then air-dried on wooden racks in the cold, clean air of Norway until it was as hard as a piece of wood. This rock-hard fish had to be beaten with a mallet and then soaked for a day or more before it could be cooked. It was nutritious, but its texture was stringy and its flavor was bland. The church's definition of fish, however, was famously flexible, leading to some culinary gymnastics that reveal the human desire to find loopholes in any system. The classification was not based on modern biology, but on the medieval understanding of the elements. Anything that lived primarily in water was considered a fish. This led to the classification of the beaver as a fish because of its scaly, flat tail and its aquatic habits. Beaver tail was thus a permitted Lenten meat for those who could get it. Similarly, puffins and even barnacle geese were classified as fish because of their association with the sea. This theological sleight of hand provided some variety for monks and nobles, but was of little consequence to the average peasant, who was stuck with his salted herring. Lent was just the longest of the fasts. The entire year was peppered with them. Every Friday was a day of abstinence from meat, in commemoration of the crucifixion of Christ. This alone removed meat from the diet for 52 days of the year. In many dioceses, Wednesday, the day Judas betrayed Christ, and Saturday, in honor of the Virgin Mary, were also observed as days of abstinence or partial fasting. Then there were the vigils the day before a major feast day, which were also fast days. And there were the Ember Days, 3 days of fasting set aside 4 times a year to mark the changing of the seasons. When all these days are tallied up, a medieval peasant was living under some form of dietary restriction for almost half the year. Their life was a constant oscillation between feast and fast, governed by the tolling of the church bell. The feast days were the glorious counterpart to this austerity. They were the moments the entire system was designed to lead towards. Christmas and Easter were the 2 great poles of celebration, but many other days provided a sanctioned excuse for indulgence. Major feasts like Whitsun, the Assumption of Mary, and All Saints' Day were public holidays, free from labor, often marked by communal celebrations. The patron saint of the local parish church would have their own feast day, a special holiday for the village, often celebrated with an ale, a communal fundraising party involving games, dancing, and the drinking of specially brewed strong ale. These feasts were the psychological release valves of peasant society. They provided hope, broke the monotony of the daily grind, and reaffirmed the bonds of community. They were also a time when the peasant could eat more and better food. They might kill a chicken, eat a larger portion of their bacon, or bake a finer loaf of bread. The Lord, as we have seen, would often contribute to these feasts, reinforcing his position at the top of the social pyramid. This spiritual diet had a profound impact on the peasant's body and the medieval economy. The long periods of low-fat, low-protein fasting, especially during Lent, would have left the population physically weakened and more susceptible to disease. Yet the overall diet, with its enforced reduction in animal fats and its reliance on whole grains and vegetables, may have inadvertently protected them from some of the chronic diseases of modern overconsumption. Economically, the church calendar shaped entire industries. The immense, year-round demand for fish fueled the growth of huge fishing fleets in places like Scandinavia and the Hanseatic League towns. It created complex trade networks that transported barrels of salted herring and bales of stockfish deep into the heart of Europe. The religious calendar was, in essence, a massive, continent-wide system of food regulation, more powerful and far-reaching than any secular law. It told millions of people what to eat, when to eat, and why. For the peasant, every meal was therefore an act of participation in the great drama of salvation, a drama in which his humble bowl of pottage was as much a ritual object as the chalice on the altar. We began this journey with a simple, almost cartoonish image: the medieval peasant, a wretch in the mud, surviving on nothing but watery gruel. Over the past 2 hours, we have dismantled that myth piece by piece. We have seen that the peasant's diet, far from being a simple matter of monotonous deprivation, was a complex, resourceful, and dynamic system, a direct reflection of the world they inhabited. It was a diet defined by obligation, shaped by the seasons, commanded by the church, and transformed by catastrophe. The story of what a peasant ate is the story of the medieval world itself. We have walked the furrows of the manorial system, where the peasant's labor was not his own, and the best of his produce was destined for the tables of the lord and the priest. We have felt the anxiety of the hungry gap in spring, a time of fasting and foraging, when nettles and wild greens were the only things standing between a family and starvation. We have experienced a fleeting joy of a summer diet-rich inn. Fresh vegetables, eggs, and the white meats of butter and cheese, a crucial time of nutritional recovery. We have smelled the wood smoke of autumn, a frantic season of harvesting, preserving, and slaughtering, where the family pig was transformed into a year's supply of precious bacon and lard. We have endured the long, dark winter, surviving on a monotonous but life-sustaining diet of dark, heavy bread and the thick, simmering pottage from the single cauldron. We have learned that bread was not just bread, but a symbol of status, and that the peasant's dark loaf of maslin or rye stood in stark contrast to the Lord's fine white wheat. We have discovered that ale was not just a drink, but liquid bread, a safe and vital source of calories that fueled a world where water was often deadly. We have ventured into the Lord's forest and understood the high-stakes gamble of poaching, a crime that promised the rare taste of fresh meat at the risk of life and limb. We have sat at the two extremes of the peasant experience, the joyous communal feast that provided a temporary escape from hardship, and the terrifying abyss of famine that could wipe out a generation. We have seen how the greatest catastrophe of all, the Black Death, paradoxically created a new world of opportunity for the survivors, ushering in a brief golden age of higher wages and a diet richer in meat and protein than ever before. And finally, we have understood how the very calendar of the soul, the feast and fast cycle of the church, commanded the peasant's plate for nearly half the year, turning every meal into a negotiation with the divine dot to dismiss the peasants. Diet as gruel is to dismiss the immense skill, knowledge, and resilience of the people who formed the backbone of the medieval world. The peasant wife was a skilled gardener, a master of preservation, a brewer, a cheesemaker, and a forager with an intimate knowledge of the wild plants of her local environment. The peasant farmer was an expert in the rhythms of his land, managing his scattered strips and his precious livestock to navigate the razor-thin margin between subsistence and starvation. Their food was not the product of refined recipes, but of a deep, practical wisdom passed down through generations. The world of the medieval peasant is gone. The open fields have been enclosed, the manorial system has dissolved, and our relationship with the food we eat has been utterly transformed. Yet echoes of their world remain. The bread and ale that formed the core of their diet are still with us. The seasonal rhythms they lived by, now a quaint choice for eating local, were once a matter of life and death. The story of their struggle for sustenance is a fundamental part of our shared human story. It is a story of inequality and hardship, but it is also a story of community, of resourcefulness, and of the enduring human ability to create a rich and meaningful life from the simple gifts of the earth. Their diet was, in the end, so much more than just gruel. It was the taste of survival. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the peasant's world. Our goal is to explore these forgotten corners of history, and your support makes that possible. If you have an idea for another aspect of medieval life you'd like us to investigate, perhaps the life of a monk, a merchant, or a knight, please let us know in the comments below. We read all of your suggestions. If you found this journey valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories from the past. Until next time, stay curious.